Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to, at this stage, I've lost count of which week it is, but I think we're around week 10 or 11. And it's my great pleasure this evening to be joined by Dr. Richard O'Leary and to talk about LGBT activism, histories of LGBT activism in Northern Ireland. And many of you may know Richard, but just to give him an introduction, he's the coordinator of Northern Ireland LGBT Heritage Project. And he's originally from Cork, but we won't hold that against him. And he has a PhD in sociology from Oxford University and was previously employed as a lecturer in sociology at Queen's University Belfast, at the ERSI and in the civil service. Currently visiting scholar in the School of History at Queen's, specialising in LGBT history. Hello to all the historians up in Queen's. Richard has been involved in LGBT activism in Ireland, North and South, over 3 decades since his time as a gay student in Queen's in the late 1980s, and took a number of successful legal challenges against LGBT discrimination. He was co-founder in 2007 of the Faith Pro-LGBT group Changing Attitude Ireland, and in 2009 of the original LGBT network in Queen's. My goodness, you've been very, very busy over the years on LGBT activism and LGBT rights and LGBT equalities. But really what I want to talk to you today is about your work, gathering an archive, writing the histories, thinking about the type of histories we could write on Northern Ireland. And you would know from what we've been looking at over the weeks here that we've been discussing those LGBT activisms in the Republic, talking some bits about Northern Ireland, but of course there is a different trajectory there, and there are different influences and different intersections that we need to take into account. The first being that in Northern Ireland, the decriminalisation of homosexuality was a battle against the non-extension of the 1967 reforms to Northern Ireland. And could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this is an example of this matter. Northern Ireland being part of the UK state was therefore affected by the earlier legislative reforms at Westminster. So in the 1950s, the British government initiated a a report about reform called the Wolfson Report, and that actually raised more awareness about the issue in Northern Ireland than would have happened in the Republic, given that Northern Ireland would have been more exposed to British media. And also it meant that the activism in Northern Ireland started a bit earlier. And when I talk about activism, I don't just want to confine ourselves to group activism, which is something we see in the 1970s. But I think that we need to go back to the 1960s in Northern Ireland, for example, with individual activism. And of course, that was stimulated by the debate in Westminster about decriminalised or partial decriminalisation, which happened in England and Wales in 1967, and of course wasn't extended to Northern Ireland in 1982. But in 1966, as an individual, Jeff Hudson would have been in communication with MPs about decriminalisation. So we can say that we have, evidence of individual activism in the 1960s. But it wasn't just a gay individual like Jeff Dudgeon, who was an activist, but also, and this isn't that widely known, there were straight allies who were very significant. And one of them, surprisingly, was a unionist MP, H. Montgomery Hyde, who in the 1950s took an issue in a number of social reform, including reform of the laws on homosexuality. And he was active in Westminster Parliament, and he paid a price. The price was that he was deselected by the Unionist Party from his constituency, which was an unusual thing to happen. And most of us believe it was because of his public support for decriminalisation. So that's, for example,
was this very much part of his own personal campaigns for social reform and equality?
It was, yes, because this was a time, I think, it was unusual for anybody to seek a legislative reform, but he wasn't a particularly religious, so that made him a bit unusual, maybe from the unionist political background. But he was interested in issues of related to prostitution, abortion, and he also was a writer, and he wrote a history of homosexuality in Britain called The Other Love. This was published after he was deselected as an MP. This in 1972, called The Other Love. So he was also through his historical work raising awareness about the historical experience of LGBT people. So that's an example that we would know.
And I would very much agree with you that we do, in doing our LGBT histories, need to name check people who actually contributed, whether they were LGBT or not, but also straight allies. And another person you mentioned to me was a woman who was also very much involved in that early phase of LGBT activism.
Yes, and her name is Sylvia Sands. She was a Londoner, progressive, liberal, evangelical Christian. She came to Northern Ireland in the early 70s to do cross-community work. And through her work, she became aware of gay men who were criminalized. Some were suffering from the effects of the decriminalization on their mental health. And she pulled together a group and was one of the pioneers of the gay Christian movement in Northern Ireland, which started in 1976, again, earlier than people might expect. But Sylvia, and here's a picture of her on the cover of a book she wrote, was someone who invited Quentin Crisp, a well-known gay performer from London, to come over to Northern Ireland, which itself would have been a significant event for the LGBT community. And he would have been, kind of a celebrity, I suppose, at the time. But Sylvia is still alive. She's in a nursing home. I visited her recently before the lockdown and wrote a feature about her for Diva magazine. So she hasn't been entirely forgotten and is now hopefully her life will be celebrated as an ally of LGBT persons.
Yes, and of course, with this non-extension of the 1967 Act to Northern Ireland, you do have the beginnings of campaigning to actually have that extended to Northern Ireland. And perhaps one of the people most associated with that, of course, is Jeff Dudgeon.
Yeah, I mean, the movement obviously was focused, particularly in the late 70s, early 80s, on decriminalisation, but initially it would have been influenced, as was the case in the South, by develops happening internationally. So you would have had a Gay Liberation Society formed by some people at Queen's University with the support of the Students' Union, but open to members outside the university. Which was a radical group influenced by the Gay Liberation Front in England, and of course that itself been influenced by what had happened in America post Stonewall. But and we had some reference with last week with Patrick McDonough recognizing that there were some early All Ireland meetings, including the organisation, the Union for Sexual Freedoms in Ireland. And you also had a group meeting in Coleraine in the mid-70s, which wasn't just focused on male decriminalisation, but also was pro-choice and looking for reform of abortion. So you had a radical milieu, and that was something which
much more radical, actually, than the National Gay Federation in Dublin, because they shied away from taking a pro-choice stance, actually, even during the 1983 anti-amendment campaign.
Well,
while they were supportive of a no vote, they wouldn't support a right to choose.
I suppose the thing we need to be aware of is that we're talking over a period of decades, and at times you might have a group of individuals who would come together, in this case around Coleraine, which would have had some English students as well. And therefore, for a while, you could have an organisation which was more intersectional and radical. And then at other times, because of personalities, or also the need to focus, because the campaign for decriminalisation was long and hard, and obviously some people decided, we need to put our heads down and focus on this legal campaign, which is very significant, and that's what the Northern Ireland Gay Rights Association, of which Jeff was prominent, would have been focused on. But of course, that was also a legal case for men, and there would have been separate things happening for women.
Yes, and of course, we spoke a little bit earlier about the fact that the RIC was, as you said, a bit more focused in on actually enforcing the criminal charges against gay men in Northern Ireland than maybe the Gardaí were in the South, and Jeff Dudgeon was one among those who was arrested.
Yes, I mean, there's two aspects of that. Jeff and others were arrested in a mass arrest of gay activists, which may be interpreted as an attempt to crush an organisation which was looking for legal reform. So, the RUC broke into houses, arrested 20-something men, attempted to trump up charges, and this was to intimidate and crush a gay reform movement, which was unsuccessful because the charges were dropped. But of course, it took a personal toll on the people involved. But separate from that, there was an increase in police kind of harassment of gay men and a clampdown on cottaging. And this was something which happened in parts of Britain as well, that, there was partial decriminalisation, but there was an increase in the 50s and 60s and in Northern Ireland in the 1970s in arrests, convictions, agents provocateurs among the police. And that was a feature of Northern Ireland. Now, it was
would this have been under indecency laws rather than criminalisation? Yeah.
Indecency laws. So indecency laws became more enforced. And I think that was partly because from the 50s, through the debate around decriminalisation, there was a greater awareness about the existence of gay men.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think that some, culture in Northern Ireland, particularly around kind of the evangelical Christian milieu, I think there would have been a determination to kind of enforce that. So you just do see a larger number of arrests and then for these indecency charges, which are pretty minor. Could be, a policeman goes into a park, maybe plain clothes, and his word against someone else's will lead to a indecency charge. And in the South, I think there was a case of the Gardaí were aware that gay men were meeting informally in parks, but didn't go after them in such a systematic way, apart from some individual incidents where Gardaí intervened, like with the Charles self-murder, where there was a kind of a mass surveillance.
Yes, and sorry, I actually called them the RIC. That's my revolutionary history coming to the fore. Of course, it was the RUC at that time. But also at the same time, there were obviously lesbians also involved in campaigns and organizations at this time. And of course, oftentimes these histories in the 60s and 70s, the lesbians become invisible because, of course, we focus in on the history of the route to decriminalization. But you yourself are collecting LGBT, so you are concentrating on all aspects of the community.
Yes, and based in a lesbian organisation, which I think is helpful to make those contacts in partnership with other LGBT organisations, is that, and you've used the term histories for the title of this conversation, which is appropriate because there are different experiences, as you said, for men, decriminalisation, and the legislative experience. And that's better known because it's been written up and it's left a lot of documents which are in the Public Records Office. Whereas the history of lesbian and bi women is not documented as well because you don't have the paper trail from the legal cases, or you don't have the paper trail from the indecency arrests and convictions. So where you will find the lesbian history is disproportionately within feminist history. So you'll have to look at the women's movement, and within that, then distinguish the contribution of lesbian and bi women activists. And a good example of that is the feminist publication from the 80s and 90s called Women's News. And Women's News isn't as well known as it should be. And I'm trying to raise awareness of it. I have a few volunteers in my project looking at it at the moment, and physical copies were held at the Linen Hall Library in Belfast, but a number of years have been digitized. So I would encourage viewers to familiarize themselves with that resource. I have a copy here of Women's News. I should say that I'm also a collector, so I'm fortunate that I have quite a number of artifacts and publications in my own house. So during lockdown, I'm doing a thing called Heritage from Home, so that even online we can share. So this example of Women's News, which says at the front, it's an Irish feminist magazine. Mm-hmm. It's got a variety of material. It's got an interview with Trouble and Strife. And with a name like that, they have to be up to something good. There's reference to International Women's Day in 1990. So apart from features on issues against the women, there's also an article on Lesbian Line Award, which was a telephone helpline. And this is from 1990, and a feature called Words Fail Us by the Mysterious Fanny Adams. So, it had a mixture of politics, but also cartoons. So this fancy magazine for women's history, but also lesbian and bi women were disproportionately involved in the production of this magazine. People like Catherine Couvert, and they're not so well known because they weren't involved in legal campaigns, but also I suppose they suffer from the general lack of knowledge about women's history generally.
Yes, twice marginal, twice invisible,
subject to double discrimination.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, then what we do find with lesbian history and bi women's history is that we get the activists, but we don't get just ordinary women living their lives in communities and in society. So that sort of social history can be missed a little bit.
Yeah, and it was again something that Patrick brought up last week about, we must move beyond just doing a history of legal reforms, but realize that there was a formation of identities, and also people were getting on with their lives. In that regard, there's a publication which I'd like to flag up. It's called Threads: Stories of Lesbian Life in Northern Ireland in the 1970s and 1980s. So, this would be a publication published 10 years ago, by women telling their own stories. And that's something which we'd all like to see more of. People, I won't even say ordinary lives, because to, be an out lesbian, it was extraordinary, in terms of the limited number of places where you could meet, it's impressive that people did manage to get on their lives. Now, that said, these are ordinary lives, but I can't let us go without mentioning a lesbian superhero, because
always like lesbian superheroes.
Yes, well, we don't have enough of them, and we could do with one now. And obviously, everything I say, I try to document. So this is Sappho Woman, and Sappho Woman was a cartoon,
and the Greater Belfast Dykes, yes,
cartoon character in women's news, and this was published in 1989 under the pseudonym Gay May Kincaid. I actually was in Belfast and bought a copy at the time, and it was a pseudonym because, of course, the author could not easily publish that under her own name. But it's partly based on characters in the scene at the time, but it also shows you the creativity that you had, and it's self-published. It's made public publishing. It's not a mainstream publication, and it wasn't sold in mainstream shops. But it was of the creativity, and even in the 1989, lesbian bi women were getting their stories out in creative ways, and this was in the archives in the Lindenhall Library, and then as part of an exhibition 2 years ago about women's lives, this emerged, and people said, "Oh, who's Sappho Woman? Who's Gay May Kincaid?" Well, hopefully, Gil McKnight, who's the actual writer, and Sappho will be better known after this.
I hope so, yes. And, at the time, of course, in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s in Northern Ireland, of course, you were dealing also with the Troubles. And in that sort of historical context, you have people coming out from both communities. So what was the scene like in many ways, or there wasn't, I presume, any one scene, but, how was it managed? It would seem to me that that the LGBT scene would have been more of a neutral space where people from both sides of the community socialized.
Yes, I've personal experience of the scene coming up from Cork to Belfast in 1988, and what struck me was, well, first is at that time the city centre was still shut down at night, so there wasn't really a social life for ordinary people at night because there were no bars open, except a gay bar. That time was a Crow's Nest, and that was because a bar owner would realise no one's going to come into the city centre apart from the LGBT community because they, have nowhere else to go. So at night, and this would have been the case in the 70s as well, you would have found, a hotel or a bar, typically straight owned, which would host LGBT people. And that was unusual because basically you had a pub or a club which was religiously mixed. And that was, rare or relatively rare at the time. So in that sense, there was more cross-community mixing within the community, and I think there were more cross-community relationships than would have happened in the wider society, and also because Belfast was small in the way Dublin or Cork was small, unlike say London, it could not sustain multiple venues. So even if people, I think, had wanted to maybe separate, there would have been commercial pressures as well.
Yes.
So I think the achievement of the LGBT community, that relatively speaking, it was more socially mixed. And that also meant, to some extent, men and women mixed with more. It was disproportionately men because they could afford to go to the pubs and that, and sometimes women had their own nights and that. But again, maybe the size of it presented it from socially splintering as much as it might have in a larger place.
Yeah. And in terms of Northern Ireland, of course, the campaign continued, or the Troubles were continuing. How were the varying actors in those, like the Unionists on one side and the Republicans on the other side? Did they have any interjections into LGBT affairs or LGBT activism?
Yes, they did. There would have been some activists in the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Movement who would have, contributed, like in various ways, including straight allies like Kevin Boyle on the Legal Front, but also, that was, it raised the level of political activism generally. The groups would have been politically diverse, but obviously you would have had people who generally more to the left. But it's not probation that some of the more prominent people in the law reform would have been from a unionist background, like Jeff Dudgeon or Richard Kennedy, who later became Ulster Unionist Party councillors. And it's been observed that on the side of activism by lesbian, bi women, they were disproportionately Republican. That's partly reflects that politically, though this came a bit later, the nationalist parties were more liberal on these issues. Do you look at this half empty, half? Generally, I think that the organizations did quite well in managing sectarian tensions compared to what was happening in the wider society. Where there was a lot less cross-community political cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And before we move on to talk about sort of religious intervention or faith-based anti-LGBT activism. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the European Court of Human Rights and the Dudgeon case that he took through the European Courts of Human Rights, because, of course, we talk very much down here, and as we talked with Patrick last week, that the history of LGBT or activism here is dominated maybe by the Norris case, and we do need to look broader than that. But I think in some ways we forget that there was also a case taken to the European Court of Human Rights in Northern Ireland by Jeff Dudgeon similarly.
I mean, Jeff Dudgeon's case is internationally significant because he was the first successful case on those grounds in the European Court of Human Rights. And that was achieved, relatively early, though obviously
1981.
Not early enough, because of course, there were many years of process leading up to that. But because that happened in 80, it made it easier then for other countries like Cyprus or for David Norris to succeed. So maybe it's not fully appreciated how other jurisdictions have benefited from that legal victory.
Yes, and it's very interesting that you say that, because we do tend, I suppose, in our way of looking at our own history as exceptional, to see the Norris case as standalone. But of course, the Dudgeon case comes before it, and as you say, influences other cases that come after in other countries, and that needs to be recognised. But one thing I'm very interested in, and I think a lot of people have forgotten about, maybe not everyone, but certainly maybe the next generation, is that all of this wasn't happening without backlash and without people certain people from certain segments of society being very concerned about the liberalization of society in terms of sexuality. I mean, as a historian of gender, obviously you see it in the backlash against abortion rights and all equal rights that women were gaining. But of course, in Northern Ireland, it being a very faith-based society in many ways, and that sectarian divide being there, you had the big Save Ulster from Sodomy campaign, which was an extraordinary thing that went on for quite a long time, and I would say impacted on very many people's lives. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, and I'm glad that you referred to anti-gay activism, because it wasn't just that there were laws there and some conservative attitudes, and there were individual or groups LGBT funded, but there was organised opposition. And in the 70s, the organised opposition was much bigger than the LGBT activism. And an illustration of that was when LGBT started to organise and started to seek legislative reform. The Reverend Ian Paisley of the Democratic Unionist Party and the Free Presbyterians organised a mass petition, which he claimed probably actually got 70,000 signatories, and of course he drove up to Stormont in a cavalcade, and this of course is whipping up homophobia because it gets a lot of attention in the press.
And no better man to whip up against any segment of society when he had a mind to. Yeah,
and he was successful at it. But what I'd also like to remember is, the fight back from the LGBT community. And one example of that was because his campaign was in 77, but the slogan stuck, and the use of the word sodomy as well is particularly kind of provocative, and he would have continued campaigning right up to 1982 and beyond. So there's a singular event in terms of the months of the petition, and then there's the awareness of this as a kind of a Christian anti-gay movement over a number of years. But two things about it which are of interest. One is, even though the Catholic Church did not formally ally with Paisley, it did come out against decriminalisation. And an illustration of that is a cartoon. Cartoons are great way of capturing, how people felt at the time. Is this one? And what you see is a picture of Ian Paisley holding hands with the Catholic Cardinal O'Fee, and it says, at last, something, we can unite on. A united Ireland, which means that the Ian Paisley and the Protestant anti-gay leadership and the Roman Catholic, leadership for the Cardinal can agree on this, which is to be against the gays.
And of course, O'Fee was Primate of All Ireland. He wasn't just a Northern Irish cleric. He was Primate of the entire country, island.
He was, yes. And the other thing about it was that, some historians, have pointed out, he was pretty jovial. He could have a drink and whatever. But the correspondence in the archive shows that before he came out against decriminalisation, he was made informed about the life experiences under decriminalisation and the negative mental health effects of it. And yet, knowing that, he came out against decriminalisation. And I think part of this was a change internationally in the Catholic Church, because things became more conservative with Pope John Paul II. And I think he knew that, and he knew the way that, theology was going to become more conservative, and he went along with that. And I think, he's another person who needs to be name checked, as who knew better, and yet, still came out against decriminalisation. The other thing I want to refer to is that there was a conference in '83 at Queen's, which was a student conference, National Union of Students and Students of Ireland, which was raising awareness about. It was actually the conference of gay students, and obviously the Paisleyites had quite a large and intimidating protest outside the Students' Union, and at that, a gay activist called Carlock McNeilis, he produced and donned a short T-shirt, which is now famous, and it's called "Save Sodomy from Ulster."
Excellent. Yes.
So, and awareness of this has been raised recently by the Out in the Past organisation, which of course has been for the last couple of years, North and South been organising public events in LGBT History Month. It's also got an annual conference. Actually, it was meant to be at Queen's last May and was cancelled to be at Queen's next year. But a play was written by Dominic Montague about this, called A Queer Ceilidh at the Marty Forsyth, which is a story of how not only did Tarlac and some students say, we're not going to take your anti-gay activism lying down, hence he dons the Save Sodomy from Ulster. But actually that weekend, some Republicans kind of embraced that group and took them to a social event in West Belfast. So this, is a story which is becoming better known. It's also becoming better known through theatre. And I also think theatre is one of the forms of activism that's not, so easily recognised, because, people are raising awareness about our lives and telling stories maybe before the historians could get to tell them. The theatre makers were getting to tell some of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes the historians are late to the telling. When we do come, we do want to do it. And they're on from the saving Ulster from Sodomy and saving Sodomy from Ulster, of course. You had a continuing legislation about the age of consent, and you had legislation about which I was very interested in, the pardons for historical convictions. And were there many in Northern Ireland, and were there many historical pardons given out?
Well,
because it's a very contested thing in Northern Ireland, of course, historical memory and pardons and things like that.
I mean, it's not something I've been, personally studying. But this, of course, comes from the awareness of the unjust conviction of Alan Turing in the 1950s in England, and a recognition that the laws of the time were unjust, and he shouldn't have been up with a conviction. So his conviction, was overturned through pardon. And then people say, well, what about other people? Maybe in similar cases, obviously, you can't say the same situation because the circumstances of an arrest or charge can be different. So there was, legislation to bring that effect in England and Wales, and then kind of belatedly in Northern Ireland. And my understanding is that only a handful of people have taken the initiative. I mean, obviously, many people are dead, or they do not want to raise this issue because of this maybe personal distress. I know 2 cases were brought forward for pardon, and there's a review, and they were not successful. And whether or not there was particularities about those cases, or whether or not that's indicative that it wasn't like a blanket, everyone in the conviction was pardoned. People had to take the initiative.
You had to actually take it. Yeah.
I think it's still important, because at least at a kind of general level, there's an acknowledgement that the law was harsh, and that people's lives were, disproportionately effectively. For example, and this again would be more a feature of Northern Ireland, we had a number of cases where, people were arrested and charged, and sometimes maybe under duress kind of pleaded guilty, thinking that they might not get publicity. But then the tabloid newspapers, and we had suicides, this would be a feature in the 80s and 90s, and that was the experience for some people, of the harsh laws. But in terms of change, what's worth remembering is that on each issue, whether it was age of consent or goods and services regulations, they had to be fought kind of on an issue by issue basis. It wasn't that they came in easily, or that they came in at the same time as in England and Wales. And there were individuals, like Jeff, or P.A. McLaughlin, the late P.A. McLaughlin, or Sean McGoran, and Mary Query, who had to fight on these issues. And typically as in a voluntary capacity. It was really only after the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we had beginnings of some funded organizations, which then, say like the Rama Project would have dealt with HIV the night before, and then that would have been able to move on to campaign in a more systematic way with some funded posts for more legislative reform.
Yes. And actually looking back, because it occurs to me, of course, having, talked to James and Cormac about HIV/AIDS and activism in the Republic, that there was, as you say at the very beginning, states do matter. And there was a different experience in the 1980s in Northern Ireland of the whole HIV/AIDS pandemic.
Well, one of the things would have been that we would have had more contact with organizations in London. So, for example, I've seen HIV awareness material. That's come from the Terence Higgins Fund, and then a local Northern Ireland address would be put on it. We also would be part of the UK media campaigns, and also because the basis of funding and funding was very important in terms of the ability to have to have clinics. I mean that's a whole area of activism in itself, and there's we say histories. There's so many projects that can be done, and there is archival material out there. It's just that some of it hasn't been physically gathered up, or if it has, it hasn't been catalogued. Which of course takes resources and money to fund it, and like that's something that would be the case in the south as well.
Now, would there be anything the equivalent? I know there would be material in the Irish Queer Archive on Northern Ireland, but there's nothing of a similar bulk and heft, I presume, in any of the archives in Northern Ireland.
Well, what you have is at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland, Jeff Dudgeon has donated most of his papers to there. So you have a very good record on an early organisation, the befriending organisation, Cara Friend. So, there's material from them there. There's material on the cases there. There's material on obviously women's news at the Lindenhall Library and some individual artifacts. I still think there's quite a bit of material in people's homes. And one of the things about our LGBT Heritage Project, which is funded by the Heritage Fund, UK Heritage Fund, is to raise awareness that we would like to receive this material, which then some of it could go to the Ulster Museum, who have a photographic collection. Some of that from Doug Soby, one of the founders of the Cara Friend organization in the 1970s. He collected a lot of photographs, and some of them made into an exhibition at the Ulster Museum. I actually think one thing that's happening in the heritage sector is that, whether it's changing times or younger or more progressive staff coming into middle management or senior positions, but we're seeing, the Ulster Museum, the Lindenhall Library kind of engaging and seeking to make connections, and that will of course help in telling our histories.
I just have a note in from Seamus Dooley. Marie Curie, I presume, played a key role in developing cross-border trade union network, along with Chris Robeson and Kieran Rose, which of course you did see All-Ireland contacts. There were a lot of All-Ireland contacts between activists campaigning on various things on both sides of the border.
You did, yes, and individuals like Mary involved in trade unions helped those trade unions to take a progressive stance. So like Unison and Unite and NIPSA, and some of them, because unions are organised on an all-Ireland basis, they were providing leadership in the way that, say, political parties generally weren't providing that leadership. For example, early motions, saying that there should be decriminalisation, or later would be marriage equality. So it's a very important part of focus. Just before we move on, I just want to acknowledge that the trans history is less well known. Obviously, within the 80s, even awareness within the community of trans would have been lower. There would have been kind of more active TV groups in the 1980s, but by 1991, trans community became more formally organised with the setting up of the Butterfly Club under Linda Marshall. But that's there's relative invisibility about the history of lesbian by women. That's even more the case when it comes to trans history. And I know that Sarah Phillips has some material, and we're actually hoping to bring her up north for her to tell us a bit about our trans
your own histories up there. Yeah. And you were mentioning when we were talking earlier about you have some trans histories that you know of. You were mentioning a woman called Wilma who was part of that.
Yeah, I mean, it was just going good. The newsletters, and one of them actually, and these would all have been done like with volunteers, like Gay Star,
yes,
which became Upstart, and one time the editor was Brian Gilmore, then Sean McGorn. I mean, they did great work in producing these news sheets on a monthly basis. It had personal effort on their part, but they would include little snips of information, and there was no obituary of Wilma, and who had died actually tragically after an operation. But there are I won't say are they ordinary individuals? No, they're extraordinary because of what they try to do in their own personal lives. But we can only sometimes come across them in a little maybe paragraph in a newsletter to say that but they're
well, that's how we layer on the histories, those little snippets.
Yeah, there's typically some life and courage, and then death is recorded.
Yeah. Just to read you a few comments from Orla Egan. She said she, in her doing her history of Cork, and we'll have Orla on next week, that the Women's News came down to Cork. There was communication between the Women's News and the Key Co-op in Cork, and the Women's News people gave information to the Key Co-op on how to create a newsletter, and vice versa. They shared resources and information and ability and all that sort of thing. And then Brendan Fay from New York was very grateful that you mentioned Tarlock McNeilish, who died unfortunately earlier in the year of COVID-19, which has swept away so many people. And he'd been involved in the campaign to get marching, to get the lesbian and gays marching in the New York parade, which we will be talking about in a few weeks as well. And so all of these histories are actually interconnected. And of course, there was a lot of leaving from Northern Ireland as well of lesbian and gay activists, because it wasn't an easy place to live, despite all of this activism and campaigning and a certain type of social life.
Yeah, I mean, Tarlock was someone who emigrated and made a great contribution to LGBT community in New York, and would have been involved in the St. Patrick's Day parade ban. Also, someone like Mark Ashton, who grew up in Coleraine and then went to England, and was one of the co-founders of Lesbians and Gays Support the Minors, which was made into the film.
The film, yeah.
So some of the histories is of people who left, but made a contribution in their wider societies. I should just like to also mention about because I can see I can also see some of the comments that are coming up. For anyone who's watching this, there's actually additional value material put in by people who are watching and commenting, including a reminder that, for example, Tarlock McNeilish's archive is at the Museum of Free Derry, which reminds me as well, of course, that there would be additional activities and individuals in Derry, even though most organisations were based in Belfast.
And Brian Lacey's papers are there too.
Yeah. Then there was there was an academic at University of Ulster collecting Richard Eakin, a trans archive, which actually has now left Northern Ireland, but is accessible online at the University of Virginia. So even in a conversation like this is an opportunity to share information and raise awareness about what's out there and who's out there. But obviously you can see it's far too little time to get to mention.
Yes, it is. It is.
But on that point, I would just like to mention that I know, for example, that like Jermone has done some interviews, which appear actually in our Altitude documentary with activists, and Edmund Lynch also, who did a lot of interviews in the South, came up north and did oral history interviews, which are on video archive at the National Museum in Dublin, I think. Yeah. So
there are archives out there, and the histories can be written, and they are being written, which is what I've discovered. And well, I did know that, and I'm doing my own little bit, I hope, with the revolutionary women who were in same-sex relationships. But it is very encouraging to see a new generation of scholars, I suppose, taking on this job of writing the LGBT histories, because they do need to be written. And the more scholars and the more historians and the more researchers and creative people that get involved in writing these histories, the better. But also people like yourself who are collectors, who are actually keeping the archive, collecting the archive and making sure those archives are secure for the future, for future researchers. And before we end, actually, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the faith pro-LGBT group that you're involved with, Changing Attitude Ireland, which of course is a very interesting aspect of our histories as well, that negotiation, in Holy Catholic Ireland or or Presbyterian Ireland or Protestant Ireland, and being LGBT, because of course there is tension with those relationships.
There's tensions of relationships. I mean, I must admit, like personally, when I came north, I was quite secular, but my late partner was Christian, and that brought me into that milieu. And I was surprised to discover that there were LGBT people of faith who were organizing. They had been organizing as early as 1976, and I mean, apart from like personally believing that people have a right to have a faith or not to have a faith, they also had a significant political role because they have been part of the movement for change. And one of the things I noticed in Northern Ireland, and maybe less so in the South, was the good relations between the LGBT people of faith who were organizing for progressive change and the secular organizations. So, a secular kind of magazine like Upstart would have carried information about what the gay Christian movement was doing. And then initially, people were kind of organizing themselves for their own kind of pastoral support and just spiritual lives. But I suppose there was some public activism for a couple of years in the late 70s, and then it kind of died off a bit. But in 2007, personally, myself and my partner said, no, it's time again to, really go public and have committees where everyone is named, try and bring in straight allies, and start kind of actively lobbying clergy, encouraging faith leaders to come out in support of LGBT people. And part of that was awareness that we knew that the churches were still significant, and their homophobic teaching was causing damage to LGBT lives. So it was an issue that we felt we couldn't be indifferent to. And since then, in Northern Ireland, and other groups have developed, which are saying that even though we've got marriage equality, there, the churches generally have negative teaching, which is having detrimental effect on an LGBT person. So how can we challenge that teaching? And also how can people in the LGBT community work with faith allies to improve our social and political situation? And let's be non-illusions, because we've seen this, of course, there's a Christian right in the USA, and there is a Christian right in Ireland. And that would have been one of the things that we would have had, particularly, Christian leaders, regularly coming out, making homophobic statements, which still happens, but to a lesser degree. And that, something that as a community, I suppose, cannot be ignored and is now also being documented. So as I said, people are held to account for what they do and say.
And so they should. And I actually can't believe we're coming to the end of an hour. We've been talking for an hour. People are saying it's very interesting and informative, and thanks for the discussion. And that's great. And I'm so appreciative of the contributors and the audience every week, and that keeps me going. And next week we will have Orla Egan talking about Cork, the Republic of Cork, because we have to have a whole show about Cork. I have to put on a whole show about Kerry then. But no, I'm really interested in Orla's work down there and developing the archive in Cork. And it takes in all of Munster. It isn't just about Cork. And next Thursday, I'm seeing from Seamus Dooley at 7 p.m, the Congress is holding a similar discussion on the role of trade unions, featuring Mary Query, Gay Cunningham and Patricia O'Donovan, and a panel discussion on the North. Details on www.ictu.ie. So that's great. Thank you for that, Seamus, and I hope people will join in for that. And I want to thank you particularly, Richard, for giving us that very wonderful insight into activism and politics and social life in Northern Ireland from the 70s, because I felt, we couldn't have this series of talks without including the entire island in our considerations of LGBT histories, because they are all interconnected and intersected. So goodbye, everybody, and thank you, Richard, and I'll see you all again, hopefully, next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.